Charles Dickens, in his great novel A Tale of Two Cities, began by describing the climate of the era as follows. He said it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of faith, it was the age of foolishness. It was an epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. If anyone has similarly ever lived in such an age of paradoxical confusion, I think it's Westernism in the second half of the 20th century A.D. Whereas Dickens makes mention in A Tale of Two Cities, there's such a conflicting and contradictory and paradoxical existence of man. How can it be the age of belief and faith and the age of doubt and skepticism at the same time? The spring of hope and the winter of despair. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And that's what we're finding today. Atomic energy, once hailed as modern man's greatest invention, now can't even deal with its own product, nuclear waste. There are people that are frightened out there at the moral decline and at the scientific advancement that we're seeing all around us, that is swallowing up the personality of man. There are people who think that the atomic clock is relentlessly ticking toward the horror of a nuclear midnight, and that there's nothing that we as the very civilized beings who gave birth to these inventions can seem to do about it. And if we ask ourselves why, people are saying, why do we see the things happening around us? Those who are less intelligent, or those I might should say who are less honest, won't even admit to what we see taking place around us. But you can go from Nightline organizer Ted Koppel up and down the ladder, and you'll find people who are rational and people who are intelligent, who may not think totally theologically as we do, are nevertheless sensitive to the great moral decline that's taking place in Westernism today. Why do we see this taking place? Well, Carl Henry had the following to say. Earlier in this century, the historian, who happened to be a liberal one, F.A.F. Jackson, remarked that all the West's distinctive virtues stem from the evangelical theology of the cross. Now, Henry's quoting Jackson, and Jackson was, if anything, not a conservative church historian. All the West's distinctive virtues stem from the evangelical theology of the cross. What for evidently modern 20th century man is just almost impossible is to look back in his 20 centuries now of European post-Calvary civilization, and he fails to realize that even with the Goths and the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Vandals, even with the barbarians that we see in early European history, that is post-Calvary early European history, that which has dominated, that which has prevailed, that which has overcome, and that which has lasted down until this day is modern Western civilization, not the Vandals and the Goths, even though they did sack Rome. Western civilization, civilized Western civilization, came to rise again. And what has kept it, what has given all of the virtues that we now possess as Westerners, but, as he writes, the evangelical theology of the cross. Therefore, the current revolt against a supernaturally grounded morality poses something of an enigma for contemporary ethical theory. In other words, what he's saying is, we have had, although almost 100% unconsciously so, we have had the theistic belief in God, basic fundamental beliefs in man, such as his inborn sinfulness, but yet the dignity of his life. We have had that as our heritage for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so why is it now that we think all of a sudden we're getting so wise that it's time to throw off all of these medieval, prehistoric notions of religion and, of course, embrace the modern scientific man? Science has not made us any better, any wiser, any happier in life. Science is not our salvation. And for all of the emphasis on education today and the power of thinking, I don't think that we have the thinking people today that we had in earlier ages. The John Deweys and B.F. Skinners of the 20th century can't rank with Aristotle's and Plato's of the past. If all of this science and education and advance, all of this is so good, why is it producing people on a lower level than the people of antiquity? Except but that God has entrusted to Western man so much knowledge about himself, about the Bible, about ancient Israel and her history, about theological concepts and matters. And man in this day and age, the one in which we are living, has chosen to reject that. And to have had that and chosen to reject that simply shows the depth to which man's ignorance has gone. He's intelligent enough to get to the moon, but he can't seem to deliver his own soul from daily problems that he faces. I mean, the technological advance is nothing if a person still lives in all of the moral and ethical quagmire that he is today. One person has written that modern man in American society today lives in sensual overdrive. So-called love has been cheapened by a series of one-night stands devoured as so much junk food, and it's producing the cult of loneliness today. With the perverted reason of man, I guess you could deduce that, well, if I have more sexual partners, somehow I'll have more fulfillment. How is it that the more sexual partners you have, the more lonely you become? Partners speak of people. Loneliness means you're alone. You don't have anyone. We're finding a problem in the way that man reasons, though. The more sexual partners, the greater your fulfillment should be. And yet we're finding it to be just the reverse. That sexual fulfillment only comes within the confines of the biblically based monogamous family. And when you don't have that, then man simply degenerates into what the evolutionists have said all along that we were to begin with, an animal. And in a very strange way, they're almost proving their own theories to be right. It would take an animal to believe that his origin is an animal. Man, educated from the Bible, knows better than that he is created in the image and after the likeness of the Almighty God, the sovereign creator of this universe. That man is not like an animal, and he has not come from an animal. His moral sensibilities are declining back to a primitive state, when, as we read so clearly in Romans chapter 1, the way Paul defends it with argument, with step after step, that first of all, God made man, then God gave man a knowledge of himself. Then man chose to reject that knowledge. And then man, in his ability to think and reason rationally, began to decline. Professing themselves to be wise, they became what? Fools, and served and worshipped the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever and ever. Amen. God gave man, original early man, a knowledge of himself. It passed down right through the garden and right through Noah and his sons. And then man chose to reject that. And man went down as a result. God lifted man back up in the supreme revelation that he gave, well, starting with the patriarch Abraham and then through the divinely given law of Moses. And what did Israel do but reject that? And so God has lifted man up again with the evangelical theology of the cross of Christ. And then man has rejected that. And when you reject that, the divinely supreme revelation that God is offering, that's the only thing that can set us on a truly thinking path. Otherwise, what we think is not thinking at all. Amen. It's absolute paradoxical confusion. Amen. The way modern man is trying to live and to exist out there in the world. And Henry says that it's due to the fact that we've surrendered basics of Western civilization. Philosophical skepticism and moral relativism, those are kind of the two tenets of modern day ideology. Be a philosophical skeptic and a moral relativist. Have engulfed ever wider reaches of modern life until a sweeping civilizational crisis now overshadows the West. When you adopt philosophical skepticism, that is, you're skeptic of everything and you can't really for certain know anything. And moral relativism, there are no standards for our life. It's just that every man is dealt with individually and privately. That's moral relativism. That's a denial of all that the Judeo-Christian heritage has stood for hundreds and yes, thousands of years. It's an exaltation of self, almost to the cult of the worship of self. That I can do what I think I can do as I read the Bible. I. It's an exaltation of self. It's a worship and a serve of the creature more than the Creator. Because that's exactly what we are, creatures and not creators. Not only do theorists who try to sustain moral imperatives independently of God disagree over the ultimate sanction of morals, but they also fail to provide any truly objective basis for their conclusions about the good and about the right. Naturalism's inability to sustain fixed ethical principles is nowhere more apparent than in its many contradictory attempts since the Renaissance to fashion a humanistic ethic, and in its increasing tendency to justify and yes, even to praise immorality. We're living in a cesspool of filth where humankind is rejecting its knowledge of God. All in the name of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, as we saw on Wednesday night. To fashion a humanistic ethic and in its increasing tendency to justify and even to praise immorality. The statistics revealed by the polls that are taken today, we'll share some more of that with you later, are just astounding. How liberal the media are. They don't believe in God. They don't even profess the worship of God. They are in favor of homosexuality. They are in favor of adultery. When I say in favor, I mean above 50% of them are in favor of those things. You still find segments of American life where you still have conservatism as the reigning doctrine, but not in the media, not in those who've gotten out there in the, quote, world, unquote, and have experienced what's in the world out there. This political, the government, the science, the education. And in doing all of that, you're surrendering these basic tenets that we discussed Wednesday night. A rationally theistic view of God, one who is transcendent, both intelligent and intelligible, the inborn sinfulness of man, the dignity of human life, the monogamous family, the so-called Protestant work ethic, and common decency. And when those 5 or 6 principles are surrendered, and they are being surrendered today, then you will have a cesspool of moral confusion as a result. And why is it that people can't seem to realize that? They can't seem to think anymore around them. Look around and see what's taking place. And we've either got the option of just following that or trying to find out what was it we had in an earlier day and age. Yes, I know it was often perverted and held to more unconsciously than any other way down through church history, but still, what did they have but fundamental beliefs derived from a Judeo-Christian heritage? And to surrender those things, whether consciously or unconsciously, is to do it to one's own ruin and destruction. Even with this fantastic growth of science and industry, we still can't solve man's basic problems of loneliness, of pride, of selfishness. If anything, the advance and the growth of industry and science are advancing man's basic problems as well. We can put people on the moon, we can send these rockets out, we can invent all types of things, but we can't deal with man himself. I think that there are some people have even made a very good case for the fact that even with a longer life expectancy now in the West, even with the death of the killer diseases of the past, of smallpox and influenza and all of these deadly diseases of the past, even with the death of those, that man basically, even in his body, is sicker today than he was in ancient history. And just take a look at AIDS. I mean, I've been reading some things about AIDS. Again, that's one of those things that we're desensitized to because we just hear it all the time. But I've been reading some things by some of the scientists researching that, and what they're saying is just astounding. They are dreadfully afraid of what AIDS is going to do. They think that it has the potential of wiping out Western civilization. We've never had a plague quite like that, and we know no cure to that at this time. And why and how just all of a sudden pops on the scene. We get our venereal diseases and we get our penicillin, and now the venereal diseases are resistant to penicillin. But nothing is like AIDS. It's frightening, the number of people that are dying and how widespread it is. And we read about that and we just think of the drug users and the homosexual community, and that's true. And basically a large percentage of it is confined there. But the scientists are still concerned. We've got innocent children now dying. We've got old ladies innocently now dying because of blood transfusions. And who but knows in the future there's going to be some new way that it's transmitted. People are afraid of how it's transmitted, and people don't really know how it's transmitted. They know it's by the blood, but what else besides that? They don't know. But a plague like AIDS that spreads basically sexually in a sexually relaxed society holds over us like a hammer and sickle. And of course, even those who are not sexually promiscuous still have the threat with blood transfusions or with a needle not cleaned in a hospital or doctor's office somewhere. Or with a dentist fooling around with your mouth and your teeth, reaching his hands in there. It's frightening what you think. Used to you just thought of germs or something, or some disease that you could get over or cure, but AIDS? It would be shocking if, I think, the general American public knew what the research scientists are saying about AIDS, that it is dreadful, that it is growing fantastically today, sometimes in hidden corners, but it has the potential of wiping out Western civilization. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, friends, when we had a bubonic plague that took a quarter to a third of the population of Europe. Amen. Just wiped them out. It wasn't that long ago in Ireland with the potato famine that it wiped the nation out. That was their basic staple food, and when you have a blight on your potato crop, you have nothing to eat then. All it takes are just a few of these things. Maybe a great explosion of some nuclear reactor somewhere in this country. I mean, in the advancement of science, we're building all of these things, but we really don't have safeguards to protect ourselves from them. It's like the gods that we are making are not gods of salvation. They're gods of destruction. And I thought God, whether small or capital G, was a symbol of salvation and protection and deliverance. But the gods that we're making are killing us. They're not our salvation. They can't save us. They are the very things snuffing out the life of Western civilization by killing its heritage. If we ask ourselves, why do we see the moral problems that we are witnesses to firsthand around us? It will always go back to the fact we are surrendering fundamental values of human existence. Man was made to serve and to love and to follow God. And if you've got some people out there who believe in God but who just choose not to follow Him, that's one thing. When you've got people who rationally set down, a David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, or whomever, who rationally set down the fact there is no God, then you have gone to the depths of unbelief then. It's one thing to believe in God and choose not to serve Him today. But it's another thing to have all of these proofs why. And here's something else interesting. It seems like it was in an earlier time, a few centuries ago, we have all of these rational proofs against the existence of God. And today I don't know that people even are too concerned about Hume's arguments and Kant's arguments and Hegel's philosophy or Nietzsche's views. I don't know that people are that concerned in actually studying and adopting and embracing these men's views. But those views came along and stripped a belief in the rationality of theism away from us, and so we are just kind of the unconscious descendants, the grandchildren of that, not knowing what the philosophies are all about, just knowing that we don't believe in God. Sometimes it may be for more of an expedient means or for an expedient reason. I think you could go on college campuses today and there, unlike what it was in years gone by, Their lack of belief in God is not so much based in some three-step logical syllogism anymore, but it's based on the fact that if I accept a belief in the deity, that's going to curtail and curb my carousing on the weekend around the campus here at college. Instead of having a rational belief against God anymore, I mean, you just see mankind swaying back and forth, back and forth. Either he doesn't believe in God for rational reasons, or he's a practical atheist. He believes in God, but he lives as though God doesn't exist. He seems to waver back and forth, but he does not have the ability to even comprehend the rational proofs for the existence of God that Aquinas and Abelard and the schoolmen and so forth were able to bring forth. Even though that maybe Hume thinks there are holes in the arguments. We'll, of course, discuss what those arguments are. The teleological and cosmological and ontological arguments for the proof of the existence of God. But I think even the Scripture itself has simple things to say about that. In Hebrews chapter 3, the writer, in talking about Moses and talking about Christ, said that Christ was a son over his own home and Moses was a servant. And then he says something along the line, but every home has a builder. Well, that may not mean a lot to you until you discuss some of these rational proofs for the existence of God. Every home has a builder. That's like the old argument that what we see out there in creation has a design, and it must have come from a designer. It's the same type of argument there. Homes don't build themselves, and homes are not built accidentally. You can even go back to our earlier tapes in creation, and we gave you whatever some mathematician's hypothetical notion was, that if you put in a big pile 10,000 bricks, how many years would it take for those bricks with the mortar laying by and boards to build themselves into a human structure? He'd come up with some figure of a trillion light years. I don't know how it could ever happen. A trillion light years or tomorrow. How could it ever happen? How could bricks and mortar and lumber build themselves into a house? But we're wanting to rule out in our life the existence of God. We don't want to deal with the deity because we know that if we accept this belief in the deity, that that's going to curb the way that we live. And we see that the way that we're living today is not being curbed at all. That would point to the fact we have lost our belief in God then. Western man, even with all of his problems, Christianity, even with all of its problems down through the years of the Inquisition and the book burning and the Crusades and all of this business, those things don't compare with the evil atrocities that we're witnessing today. I mean, at least in those days, they did have 1.5 million abortions per year in this civilized United States of America. The communists are often prone in mockingly pointing to the fact that, well, you Christians, you Western Christians, it took you 19 centuries to finally rid yourself of the evil of slavery. But someone had the right retort, yes, and it took you communists just one generation to bring it back. The very things they point out that have been wrong with Christianity, and perhaps they have been, are being reproduced on a larger scale by people today. The secularist, the naturalist out there looks at Christianity and says, oh, I can't follow that. Look at your heritage, those poor, innocent pagans living in Palestine, and God sent those bloodthirsty, nasty Jews in there to wipe all of those people out. And look at your history with the Inquisition and with the Crusades and with even modern religious wars in Ireland between the Catholics and the Protestants. How can we believe God is behind all of that? Well, listen to what Henry again has to say. We should remind the humanist critics, however, that world history records no persecution and inhumanity more debased and cruel than that waged against theists and dissenters under the banner of atheistic philosophies and rulers. Examples include the Hitler regime's murder of 6 million Jews and vast numbers of Gentiles. That was small fry. We're talking about this century. Stalin's destruction of 15 million Russians. That was this century. And Mao's, the Chinese leaders, approved murder of some 25 million Chinese in the Cultural Revolution. 6 million Jews in Nazi Germany was nothing. Mao in this century after that murdered 25 million Chinese. You can add it up. 25 million, 15 million, 6 million, then add the 45 million for the Second World War and about 20 million for the First War. Vietnam's 51,000, again, small fry. You add that up and man is killing himself. But I thought we were educated, enlightened now to all the social, political problems of society. More people have been murdered in this century than all of history combined. Nothing in the history of mankind can match this 20th century brutality in a time frame that scientific naturalism extols for its technocratic genius and as the pinnacle of human progress. You see what we're talking about in quoting Dickens to you? It was the worst of times, it was the best of times. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. How is it on one hand we've got the pinnacle of human progress, modern, second half of the 20th century AD, Western, civilized, scientific, technocratic man who can't solve his own marital problems. Marital problems, social problems, I mean social in the fact of you getting along with your next door neighbor. Personal problems, mental problems. Those are the worst forms of problems. Those are the ones that humans want to deliver themselves from, and they can't. They're always busy running around inventing something, maybe some labor-saving device, but it's really not satisfying the deep need that they have in their own heart, in their own life. That is why, don't ever be too critical of the people that you meet, whether they're Christians or non-Christians, who decide just to flee this society and go and try to live in harmony with nature. They're doing a lot better than those who are living out of harmony with their own nature while embracing all of the scientific greatness that we see taking place around us. That seems to be creating, or if nothing more, reproducing the basic problems that man has right now himself. With all of the industrialization and all of the advancement that we see taking place around us. C.S. Lewis and his brother went to a movie back in 1933. And it was a movie kind of extolling some of the greatness of, the first 30 years of this century in England, that they had survived the Boer War and the death of Queen Victoria and the Great War and even some of the problems of the Roaring Twenties. And a song was written and rehearsed on this night that read as follows. Why is it that civilized humanity must make the world so wrong? In this hurly-burly of insanity, your dreams cannot last long. We've reached a headline, the press headline, every sorrow. Blues value is news value tomorrow. And the refrain goes, blues, 20th century blues are getting me down. Who's escaped those weary 20th century blues? Why, if there's a God in the sky, why shouldn't he grin high above this dreary 20th century den? In this strange illusion, chaos and confusion, people seem to lose their way. What is there to strive for? Love or keep alive for? Say, hey, hey, call it a day. Blues, nothing to win or lose. It's getting me down. Blues, I've got those 20th century blues. Blues value is news value tomorrow. That's all the news wants to report, are blues values. And C.S. Lewis himself treats this same problem of the dehumanization and the lack of worth of living anymore in the 20th century in his book Pilgrim's Regress. You're familiar with Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Maybe you haven't yet read Lewis's Pilgrim's Regress. But it's an allegory again with very fantastic characters, just as patterned, of course, after Bunyan's allegory. And he has a man who's called Guide, and he's helping John. He's the figure rather than Christian. John is the figure, John the Pilgrim, pass through the land of ignorantia. And Guide has this song. Iron will eat the old world's old beauty up. Girder and grid and gantry will arise. Iron forest of engines will arise. This is in the 1930s, remember. Crisscross of iron crochet. For your eyes no green or growth. Over all the skies scribble from end to end with boasts and lies. When Adam ate the irrevocable apple, thou sawest beyond death the resurrection of the dead. The second verse, clamor shall clean put out the voice of wisdom. Clamor shall clean put out the voice of wisdom. People are just clamoring about things. The printing presses with their clapping wings, fouling your nourishment. Harpy wings, filling your minds all day with foolish things, will tame the eagle thought. The ability man once had to soar high and to think well, will tame the eagle thought till she sings, parrot-like in her cage, to please dark kings. The new age, the new art, the new ethic and thought, and fools crying, because it has begun, it will continue as it has begun. The wheel runs faster, therefore the wheel will run faster forever. The old age is done. We have the new lights, and we can see without the sun. Days ago I wrote it down. When in your life have you ever met, out in your daily activity, an old gray-headed bearded gentleman who actually had any deep words of wisdom to say? You don't even find old people who can think anymore. You think of what people tell you when you talk to them. Who has just wells of living wisdom that you would gladly sit at their feet and drink from them? You don't find people like that anymore. You find old people who are making apologies for the fact that they're old, who make excuses for the fact that they're old and can't get around anymore. Instead of glorying in the gray hair, they're making excuses for the fact they have gray hair, or they try to cover it up with color for their hair. I thought about that. How many people do I meet? You talk to people and they have such foolish things to say, such worldly, carnal things to say, so empty of any depth at all. When is the last time I met someone who actually had something wise to say that was so deep in thought and wisdom that I had to sit down and ponder what they were saying? You pass old and young and middle age alike, and it's clamor, it's killing our wisdom. Well, when we surrender our reasonable faith for a rational theism, original sin, common decency, the monogamous family, when we surrender that for belief in the essential goodness of man, which is a tenet of modern 20th century Western philosophy, the essential goodness of man. Every man is basically good. If you can give him a job, then he'll do right in life. If you could give him a little education, then the education will light the spark of the divine in him, and somehow he'll end up good. The doctrine of the essential goodness of man is a doctrine of liberal theological education. It's a doctrine of the social gospel movement. It's a doctrine basically of Western civilization in the second half of the 20th century. When we surrender the things I just listed for this belief, the belief in the essential goodness of man, for a belief in the death of God, for a belief in the inevitability of progress, for a belief in a utopia just around the corner, then that spells not the death of God, but the death of man. Science, progress, industry, education, they are not our salvation. those things have not made man any better, any wiser, or any happier. No one who has any ability to think at all could dispute that, or would even want to dispute that. He knows that it's true. Those things have not made any man better, smarter, wiser, happier. They have not improved man's lot in life. They tend to complicate man's lot in life. And man is worse than were his forefathers. I'm sure if you've been raised in church, you're familiar with what we used to chant religiously, the Apostles' Creed. It began, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. I think today that is supplanted by what I would call the Apostate's Creed. That's much shorter than the Apostles' Creed, and I would read it as follows. I believe in Big Bang yesterday, Big Bucks today, and Big Brother tomorrow. And that to me spells the big blank of human existence today. In an earlier time, when the Big Bang theory of the origin of all things was held, that was extolled as the greatest discovery we have. That passed out of fashion. That is in vogue again today. Even though Big Bang doesn't explain where Big Bang came from. It's always remarkable. We discussed this in our earlier creation class. We're asking people, what was the origin of all things? Well, there was a time when some molecules were together and they exploded, the Big Bang theory. Well, from where did the molecules come? They never will go back far enough because they're afraid. And man's so finite, he wants to finitize everything around him. He just won't believe in the infinite God. Where did those things come from? Well, they came from, they were always here. Well, are we to believe in the infinity of matter? That's an awfully large thing to believe in. Modern man says he believes in that, but I think a person is incapable of truly, rationally accepting that. The eternity, that is from beginning to end, of the eternity, the infinity of matter, of the created order as we would refer to it by. I believe in Big Bang yesterday. I believe in big bucks today. It's the age and the spirit of materialism. I believe in Big Brother tomorrow. We're 3 years past Orwell's date of 1984. And I don't think that all that Orwell said has come to pass. He wrote it in 48. That's why he picked 84 as the date for fulfillment. But one thing we are seeing, and I have said this in recent messages, is the encroachment on states' rights, on personal rights by the federal government. Everything is now down to a law. I mean, almost down to where you can spit or where you can't. It's down to a law punishable by fine. Where you spit, where you walk your dog, whether you have a dog. All of these laws encroaching on what at one time was thought to be personal freedom and liberty couldn't help but spell for me Big Brother tomorrow. You say, I don't even see how you can reconcile that with this great age of personal liberty and freedom that we are in America. Well, they do go together. Because a person who adopts a false view, God's going to give him the just recompense of that view, and it will never produce what man plans for it to produce. What we think and we ask for freedom, freedom, freedom. The government's turning around and giving us government, government, government. And it's kind of like one of those books said, I guess that was Huxley's work, A Brave New World, that the position of big-time government, a big brother in the future, will be to teach man to love his chains. It won't be to free man. It'll be to teach man to love his chains. And the government's after that with all of its propaganda, that these laws are for the best of society, for the good of all of you people out there. We can't extol just one person. This is the best for everyone. And I think Huxley was right. We're seeing that in government, that the process of government and a purpose in its propaganda is to teach us to love our chains, to teach us to accept our chains, to teach us to enjoy the chains that we have. Let me go a little earlier in history and go back to what we were talking about on Wednesday night, the Renaissance period. René Descartes, a post-Renaissance French philosopher and mathematician, perhaps is best known today for cogito ergo sum, which into English from Latin translates cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Ever heard of that before? It's a production of the Renaissance and Enlightenment period, which then I think itself turned around and served as fuel for the same period. But in this fantastically presumptuous and arrogant statement, I think, therefore I am, Descartes lifts naked thinking to the apex, submerging all else of humanness under it, that is, the ability to think, or the desire to think, and almost equates sheer thinking with personhood. It served as fuel, as one person has written, for the Enlightenment, empiricism, the scientific method, the primacy of logic, the objectivity of reason, the preeminence of managerial and mechanical efficiency. The moment that Descartes uttered this, has been described by a late Archbishop of Canterbury as, and I quote, the most disastrous moment in the history of Europe. But you might say, well, I thought that's what we were talking about. Thinking, it's good to think. That's what God wants us to do, is to think. But notice in cogito ergo sum, Descartes is not concerned about what he thinks, or how he thinks, or why he thinks, but that he thinks. And that is what makes all the difference in the world. There are certain periods and there are certain ideas that overlap. There are certain times where we need to make clear division between what someone else has said or done and what we're saying that we should say or do. He's not concerned about what you're thinking or why you're thinking, any moral responsibility placed upon the thinker, because he's taken upon himself the right and privilege of thinking, but the simple fact that he thinks. I think, therefore I am. I think today, whenever this phrase here is quoted, the I's are often emphasized. I think, therefore I am. One writer notes that this Cartesian egoism, the doctrine of enlightened self-interest, then leads to American egotism, the heresy of the imperial self. In Cartesian philosophy, Descartes probably thought of this as, I think, therefore I am. Today it's often quoted, I think, therefore I am. To give you the quote again, we go from the Cartesian egoism, the doctrine of enlightened self-interest, to American egotism, the heresy of the imperial self. This gave fuel to scientific method, to scientific reasoning, to industry and everything, this Latin phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. What actually is Descartes trying to say through this? I mean, is he lifting thinking so high, submerging everything else in humanness underneath that, that thinking becomes all there is, and that thinking, not what you think, why you think, how you think, but thinking That's all that exists. He fails to note that there is a moral obligation levied on every thinker. You're taking on to yourself a privilege and a right that God would allow, but with that comes a responsibility of thinking correctly. God doesn't give man the right to think whatever he wants to think. He does. That's not God's right, though. That's not the right that God has given to man. It's not what we think, it's not how we think, it's not why we think. I don't think that the purpose of Cartesian philosophy and Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I don't think the purpose of that was to know. I don't think the purpose of this was to know. But I think the purpose of it was to subjugate the object. Now follow with me for a moment on this thought here. I mean, to know Christ is gain. To know Him is eternal life. I don't think that this philosophy, I think therefore I am, had as its purpose or its goal knowledge to know something, but simply to subjugate the object. Now watch what I mean by this. Around us, we have people that are following this all the time.
Amen.
But I don't think they're ever coming to any knowledge about something. Knowledge means you understand origins, conclusions. Knowledge means you understand the hows and the whys of it. Knowledge means that you understand God's relation to the object that you're thinking. Knowledge, wisdom, means you understand your relation to it. To think, we would say its goal is to know something, not to just think about it. But what do we have today with all of our scientific study, investigation, and statistics is simply the brutal, bare subjugation of the object. We've got it now. We can spit out formulas about this. We can give all of the statistics about the divorce rate in America, but we don't know what divorce is, though. Do you understand what I'm saying? If we knew what divorce was, it is a personal social horror of the highest order. When a man and woman have come together in holy matrimony, as we saw yesterday, they are committing their lives to each other. I love you. They experience sexual oneness with each other. And then to have that broken and go marry someone else and sleep with other people, that's a horror personally and mentally of something I couldn't even imagine. I couldn't imagine leaving my wife and going to be with another woman or seeing her with another man. That must be the emotional horror of the highest order. See, we can talk all about divorce, and we say divorce is caused, the people out there, the observers in society, well, it's caused by this, and 44% of the people say this about it, and 62% of scientists say this, and 98% of journalists say this. What are you doing? You're subjugating brutally just the bare subject, the topic. This is divorce. We've got it now. But you don't really know what divorce is all about. You don't really know. We think that we can describe what life is like, that man's body is made up of so many chemicals, about 80, 85, 90% of it's water, and the rest of it all these little chemicals that we have. That's not man's life. Man was made in the image of God. God has no water or chemicals in his life. And man will continue to live and survive and exist long after this body of minerals and water perishes. So you haven't said anything, but you've brutally subjugated the object by saying, here's what man is. And we can tell when he begins. Most people say it at the moment of birth. When he goes, and then he starts crying. There, man begins. Well, the Bible doesn't teach that. Man begins back at the moment of conception, not at the moment of birth. And then when does man come to an end? Well, he comes to an end when he dies. Oh, no, he doesn't. There's a life after life. Man will continue to live and live and live forever, either in hell or in heaven. Here's what I'm saying then about this business. We've got people who are following this. Well, I think, well, you think, well, we all think. And they really don't think. They don't think with the purpose of coming to know something. They simply think with the desire to brutally subjugate the object. How do we know that's what they're after? It's because of this statement here. You haven't said enough with this, I think, therefore I am. Why do you think? How do you think? And what do you think? I think, therefore I am. What you think is the most important thing. That makes all the difference in the world. What a person thinks, not just that they think. It's interesting that when we go back to the Garden of Eden account, man being given a certain ability to think and a certain amount of rationality, made in the image of God, that is then used and then twisted and corrupted by the serpent. That's why I'm saying man always stands with a moral obligation over him as a thinker. You know, you've heard other people say every man is entitled to his own opinion, as though it's just free world, free inquiry, no consequences. That's a false statement. That is not true, because it's too bare. It strips all responsibility away from man. Man has a moral obligation he's responsible to because he's a thinker. Look what happened. Adam proves that. Eve, they proved that. They chose to use their reasoning faculties. They chose to use it in a corrupted fashion. And they fell as a result of that and plunged their descendants into their own ruin. There's a figure in Shakespeare's Macbeth, Banquo, who warns Macbeth in Shakespeare's play Macbeth. Banquo warns Macbeth with these lines: "And oftentimes to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths. Win us with honest trifles, to betray us in deepest consequence." In Plato's Republic, Plato tries to give a visionary approach to the various orders of human understanding or human knowledge by means of a vertical line. And he draws this vertical line and he divides it in half, but in two unequal portions, which let's say would look probably something like this. Or I should even put it a little higher than that. Let's move it up to even here. Or maybe we should even move it up a little higher than that. There. No, in fact, we need 3 lines, not just one. And so we have our first group of people here, our second group of people here, our third here, and our fourth here, all heading toward what he called the good. Of course, he was an atheist who didn't believe in God, but what he called the good, the right and the good. And he called this area of knowledge, number 1, which as you can see is the largest area because it's filled with the most people. He called this conjecture. Second level, he called faith. But what he meant by faith was simply common sense. And what he meant by both of these was that they stand in relation to the visible world. Then his third level of thinking is a smaller group of people, by the way, he called understanding. And his highest level was intuitive knowledge. Well, let me see if I can read from, again, another writer's work. Sorry I'm having to borrow so much from all these writers, but these are the things that have influenced history since then, and philosophical thought. But let me see if I can borrow from another writer's thoughts, where he characterizes, maybe caricatures would be a better term, the people in modern American second half of the 20th century AD life, that society, that fit in these different categories here. First of all, we had this group of people. The bottom of today's mass culture are those poor souls endlessly chasing after the phantoms and delusions of materialism. Now, you got to be careful here. He's not calling these people materialists here. They don't have anything. It's the poor people, the ignorant people, he said, who are endlessly chasing after phantoms and illusions of materialism. They are the followers, fans, spectators, imitators. I'm amused oftentimes when you think of these great sporting events and the thousands and thousands of spectators that go to these things, lusting after the physical bodily abilities of these men or these women on the floor or the track or the field below there, but who themselves, those sitting in the stand, are nothing but ignoramuses. They couldn't come close to doing what those can do. And yet look what's happening to those who can do something. They're able to control all the masses here, by which they'll line their own pockets. You know, as we have often complained before, these baseball, football, whatever players, they don't deserve these $1 million a year contracts. And you know what? They wouldn't have them if none of us would go watch them run around like silly goons out there. We're trying to almost get exercise or reach a period of bodily excellence vicariously through watching them. They wouldn't even have that if we wouldn't spend our money to go watch them. So he said, I call this lower class. These are the people who don't think, who don't even have the ability to. They are the followers, the fans, the spectators, and the imitators. Unconsciously searching for the realities called philosophical truth, political power, and social freedom. The masses clutch at shadows and images. And he gives some description or some examples. Teenagers adoring a reprehensible singer. Union members re-electing a corrupt official. Indolent sophisticates clogging their nostrils with cocaine. The second level of today's society, we have materialists. These are the people who have nothing, but they just idolize those who do and follow around, filling their pockets with that. Western civilization has always worshipped material things, trinkets, toys, baubles, luxuries, yes, but above all things, gadgets and whiz-bangs and better mousetraps that we call labor-saving devices. Modern society actually believes in and puts faith in these items. We've got the third group of people. Now we're beyond the visible realm. At the level of opinions and hypotheses are the ideologues and perpetrators of half-truths under the guise of, quote, information. Most, if not all, broadcast journalists, news commentators, investigative reporters, editorial spokesmen, and other more or less surreptitious shapers of public opinion rise no higher than this stage. They are to truth what rumor is to fact. The polls they conduct contain the same sort of disclaimer now required for automobile advertising: your mileage may vary. That's what you hear in the news media all the time. He says they are to truth what rumor is to fact. And who does he include here but the ones that are supposed to be the best, you know, the 60 Minutes type thing, investigative reporters. They are to truth what rumor is to fact. The polls they conduct contain the same sort of disclaimer now required for automobile advertising: your mileage may vary. Isn't it interesting how the government, the automobile industry, dupes us on that one? They'll put, 28 estimated miles per gallon there, and then in parenthesis or small print, but your mileage may vary. Well, it's my mileage that I'm concerned about, not your test car. It's only my mileage that I'm concerned about. So why even go to the trouble of giving me what you say yours will get when you say that mine will vary? And what about these polls whenever they say, now this poll has a plus or minus 4-point margin error? Well, if you're interviewing 44 people about a subject, you either got it right when they gave you the report or you didn't get it right. How could you say it's a 4 or more points plus or minus margin error here? But of course, I know what they say is, well, we can't interview everyone. It's a representative group of people that we interview, and so it could be this much or that much, one way or the other, that we could be wrong. Not to be excluded from this group are too many of the evangelical broadcasters whose programming similarly thrives on sensation, personality, and the reduction of complex issues to the simplest formula. If citizens whose only source of news may be, you give us 22 minutes and we'll give you the world, are ignorant of cause and consequence, then Christians whose diet of spiritual nourishment depends largely on religious broadcasting remain in a state of arrested development and stunted growth. They are deprived of an authentic Christian education. The fourth level of people, they do not exist. Nobody's left to think anymore. Clamor is killing our wisdom. We've got these idiots down here. We've got the materialists who all they want are, he calls, trinkets, toys, baubles, luxuries, gadgets, whiz-bangs, and better mousetraps called labor-saving devices. That's all they can think about, is material acquisition. And they think the accumulation of goods equals the good. Plato's good, the good life, is the more you can accumulate. And then we got people up here in 3 who they're the ideologues and the perpetrators of half-truths under the guise of information. They're the ones who say they know something but don't know what they're saying. They're the ones who talk and reason, and, you know, all philosophers and lay philosophers really fit right there in that group. And in the top group, they do not exist. No one who's able to think anymore. Well, there is a call and a challenge that goes out from the Word of God, and it goes out mightily. And that is the call to think, and the call to know, and the call to be free in life. But it will only come by the knowledge of the Word of God. Amen. People are wanting liberty and freedom, but the greatest liberty, freedom text is John 8:31 and 32. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. That's what people are after. Freedom, knowledge, wisdom. You'll get it when you get the truth. And you don't get the truth through philosophical skepticism and moral relativism. You get it through the priceless, inerrant, inspired, that which has existed down through all of these countless centuries, Word of God. The other books were written and have come and gone, but this one has remained.